So I thought this was a very good way to start off the season by both teams. Good debate. I think that both sides did a good job of sort of interpreting Morrison's work on Beloved. That was one of my favorite portions of the debate. I think that using Morrison's Playing in the Dark to also help, especially on the affirmative side, to get additional analysis and contextualization of how it gets used against whiteness. And I think that that could be specifically helpful when you start talking about the ways in which you're subversive. I think using that work because she contextualizes the way subversiveness can work within the academy and within literature and fiction and stuff like that. I think that that's really good because it's one of the things that she does. It's not just fictional, that's interpretive, but then also is actually talking about the way academic spaces function and things along those lines. In the end, I end up voting negative, and I vote negative. I think the Giroux evidence is a large portion of it that I don't have a specific response to. Is that when you're focused in terms of the discursive constructions, capitalism is able to take that and be able to utilize it how it wants. And the argument that you have that is responsive to it is doesn't matter if it's co-opted. We're already co-opted. We're one step ahead of that type deal. But if it's constantly just being co-opted and you're just one step ahead, but then you get co-opted again and then co-opted again, how is that then subversive, right? And so I think that if there's a better explanation of why you're subversive, that'd be good. But a lot of times, throughout the debate, both of you end up saying, we're subversive, without a description of what you are subversive outside of, well, you read fiction, right? And so that's why I'm suggesting doing Play in the Dark that could get into that subversive element. But then I think you could also make arguments like individual survivability, why it's important that even if the collective and even if these stories get co-opted, that's important for the two of your survival, reading the Gums evidence or stuff along those lines that explains how individual relationships to create that form of resistance and subversiveness, even if being co-opted, becomes fundamentally irrelevant. So I think that's the first thing that becomes important. And I think that in the 2AR, you mentioned that you're not just discursive, that you're focused on the material consequences of the ways these things take place. I think that argument should be earlier in the debate because I think that one of the things that they're clear about link-wise is that your focus on discursive avenues as an avenue of change will never be able to account for the material conditions. So we might understand identity different, but if the material conditions don't change, then those identities are still going to be destroyed, whether it be the black body or the poor white body and things like that. So I think that you need to have explain how you're also dealing with those material conditions a lot more explicitly. And the other thing that I think is good, I think that in the 2NC and the 2NR, you do a good job of explaining how capitalism was used in order to recreate racism by separating the poor whites from the black slaves and stuff and things along those lines, which makes it impossible for them to create a coalitional rallying point to be able to shatter structures of capitalism. And that's one of the things that I think that the affirmative could be answering is sort of doing another sort of example of how racism is what caused capitalism to come into existence. Because her analogy about capitalism is what allowed poor whites to refuse to work with black slaves, I think that analogy could easily be responded to being no, racism is what allowed that propagation of capitalism, because it meant that the poor whites didn't want to work with the slaves because they wanted to still get those dollars, or because they were able to then be able to recreate the racism and say that we're better than them because we're still not a slave. And so whiteness came first as a way to structure things like capitalism, sort of make that reverse claim. I think that I was sort of buying some of the intersectional arguments that you're making earlier, and I don't think the 2AR goes for the permutation as strong as that it could have been. I think that is where a lot of it's coming out of, because your strategy against capitalism is twofold. One, it's the permutation, we're always already intersectional, and then two, they're making these universalized claims. In regards to universalized claims, I think that the neg does a good job of explaining how they allow capitalism to explain the nuances between races and how different material consequences play itself out individually, so it's not necessarily universalized. And then in regards to the permutation, I just don't think there's enough work there come the 2AR, given that the 2NC does a lot of work on sort of the ways in which it gets glossed over and the focus on the discourse ignores material conditions and things like that. So I think that having more in the permutation in the 2AR would be good. And I also think that creating a bigger diversity of offense against capitalism would be good, right? I think using capitalism against itself would be a beneficial strategy to be able to take, whether it be Gibson Graham or something else, that capitalism is not necessarily always bad. And especially for black people where they haven't been given access to all capitalist avenues of resistance and things like that, it becomes then important to not just be oh, well, now you can't utilize these tools that white people have continuously used consistently to gain up all of this privilege, and then as soon as you are well, we're engaging in capitalism, oh, no, you all shouldn't do that type of thing, right? So I think that it's important to say that it is incorrect for whites to say you can't gain access to avenues of resistance that white people have used historically, because now we recognize that capitalism is fundamentally bankrupt, but simultaneously, whites have privileged themselves based upon systems of capital already, and so to deny any usage of that for black people makes it impossible for us to be able to sort of change that. So it becomes a situation where you shouldn't just totalize capitalism as always being bad, but it could be used in transgressive ways, right? And Morrison's work could be an example of that, right? It's something that you don't ever say is that, well, this fiction is sold and reproduced within the academy again and again. It's said a little bit in the 1 hour, but not as clear on the 2NC and the 2 hours I think it'd be, right? Like she wins prizes on this. Like this is like upheld within the academy, and capitalism is like a great way to create exchange, right? But then that's the same thing, the process of buying and selling fiction in order for this to reach out became a form of resistance for that to be able to actually disrupt the ways in which people traditionally understood fictionalized processes, right? Instead of just reading Faulkner, then now classes have emerged that have put Faulkner in relation to Morrison to understand the racism that came up within the Faulkner trilogies and stuff like that as well. And so the engaging of capitalism in this way through things like fiction becomes a way to sort of use it against itself. And I think that, being able to make those sort of arguments makes it easier to understand how you would be subversive and how capitalism could be utilized against itself, fiction being a great example of it. I do really like your answer to the academy co-option argument that assumes individual and real stories, not fictionalized stories. The academy can have our fictions, but they can't have our lives. That argument that you make, I think that that's a great answer to the academy co-op stuff, because you'd be like, listen, we could talk about our fictionalized lives, but not like those tangible real lives. And I think that in order to get me on to win that academy co-option argument, that's the thing that you have to answer for. Why is fiction necessarily just as commodified and co-opted by the academy versus real life stories? And I think the difference would be is like fiction can be spun differently, so it necessarily doesn't always have to be co-opted within that same sort of sense as the way like someone's individual stories are taken by social scientists and re-articulated. So in order to win the academy argument, I think that's what needs to take place.
So I was wondering, so if you think that the fiction argument is good about like how we answer the academy argument, like why doesn't that, like I feel like that argument could play into like how we produce knowledge that's only good for, or that is good for the black community, and it doesn't matter how other people interpret it because that always happens.
Well, their argument is not that it'll ultimately be bad for the black community as well, because capitalism will then take those fictions and then use it against the black communities in order to reinstate things like racism. So I think it's slightly different than the academy co-op type arguments. But I get exactly what you're saying. I think that a little bit more work there could then explain like how, that cuts against capitalist strands of thought as well, opposed to just like academy strands of thought. I think would be beneficial.
Is there any like empirical examples they give of fiction being used against our black communities?
They do not give any empirical examples of how fiction is used against black communities. What they have is more like historical examples about how racism has been structured by things like capitalism, which then is connected to, if they then participate within the capitalist structure, that will destroy the ability for us to be able to address things like racist, which they give sort of historical examples of. And so if those historical examples are reinterpreted to say, no, actually racism is what structured capitalism to exist, then I think that would be sufficient in order for me to end up voting affirmative in that round. But if it becomes capitalist and then capitalism is what allows racism.
What about the argument about how like racism in the modern time has created a new scheme of repression? Like it's different, it's modeled off of things like different acts of racism exist independent of things like class, which is why why it says that that's why more working class individuals are different are treated differently than black people.
All right. I guess what are the new modern instantiations of where this taken place?
Because
Right.
root cause capitalism that created racism, and even if that's true, that doesn't mean that the act is not important.
Right. It definitely doesn't mean the app is unimportant, right? But if it's a question of which is a better way to go about attacking these things, and I believe that rejecting capitalism is a better way than sort of forefronting race, and that becomes a better way to gain access to sort of solving race. I think if you give because there what you said is good in an argument that I believe, but there's not examples of how these modern forms of racism is differentiated from past forms of racism, whereas she has that slavery prevented and fracturalized coalition argument. If you explain why that is no longer true within the contemporary era with another example, then I think that would click and make a lot more sense as being okay, so you might have that might have been a great strategy back in the time of slavery, but now it is no longer a great strategy because these examples disprove that, opposed to sort of having the claim out there and not the warrant to why that claim is true, right? But the argument that you're speaking definitely rings true to me, and I think it's a matter of just sort of fleshing it out a little bit more. All right. The other thing I'd say is that their organ stuff, your organ links, I don't think really apply to them at all, because they're clearly not saying that we should sell organs, right? So I think every time we start talking about that is not really pertinent or relevant to the debate because they aren't saying we should sell organs within a capitalist exchange.
Is just like the plan text.
The plan text was not the link that I thought was that was not the link that I ended up believing. The discourse versus materiality is the link that I end up giving them. What was your question?
Yeah, so I felt like I had a lot of problems with organization.
Yeah.
What should I have done?
Well, I don't think you efficiently go down their arguments, answer their first, their second, their third, their fourth. You sort of answer them sporadically, and you start with this really big, lengthy argument. And I think it's because they say they have a permutation, but they don't actually ever make a permutation, right? So you're like, well, I guess I'll start by answering the permutation, but then that becomes the majority of your speech, opposed to being like, you know, I mean, like, they claim they have a permutation in cross-X. Here's my answer to the permutation. Now, their first argument is that, you know, what is their first argument? That class universalization is bad. And now here are my responses. But all that sort of ends up on the permutation debate. And so by the 2NR, everything is sort of all over the place in the end. But I do think that some of it is some of the affirmatives issues. Like the 1AR isn't clear about when they're from case to university to cap, and so that makes it difficult for you to sort of create those delineations. But I think that you could be like, draw a line here. These are where he's starting to make these other sorts of arguments. I'll answer that in a bit. I like the 1NR. I think that in terms of doing your interpretation work, I think that you could do a better job of impacting it, right? Like, so if it gets co-opted by the academy, I don't necessarily know why is that bad? Why is that going to make things worse, especially in light of their argument that co-option's already taken place? How is, in like your sense of, well, worse is worse, it's more, it's bad, right? You know, a bigger impact or argument to that, I think, is what you need to have. Okay? Oh, last thing is, like, I don't know, like, I don't think I'd really spot you any of the stuff that you end up saying in the 2NR. Like, I don't think, like, when you talk for, like, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, to me, I think that that's a point where you should, like, hand the laptop off for your partner to read it. Like, and I'm okay with people speaking in the same speech if it's, like, sort of, like, the way that you're debating and having it, but that, like, throughout the entirety of this debate, it was not, like, speech time is separate.
I read that part is because I didn't want, at least the first part of that, to seem as if Sarah was saying, this is what Tony said, and I'm going to interpret what Tony said, rather than, because then that puts like the white base on to telling them how to do.
Okay, yeah, I would maybe even make that as an argument. This is important that she's ceding space to me for me to be able to make these interpretations so that way blacks will be in control of the way that we understand this to take place. Otherwise, it's like, and then when she got back to being in her speech, like there's like, and so this is a reason to vote negative, and there wasn't any other further. It's not like she built off of you. It was sort of like, to me, it looked like she didn't have the prep time to be able to make these arguments or hand it, so she was just like, here, go. And then at the end, it was like, well, no, I have nothing else to say. That's how it came off. So, yeah. So if you're going to do that, just explain why you're doing that, and then I'd have no problem sort of evaluating it or like being like, oh, this is a cool way of going about making these arguments.
Does that make sense to you, though?
Does.
Why?
Yeah. No, completely.
After we,
Completely makes sense to me, but it's just like not present prior. So.